I know how deeply you, the entire nation, and I think I may say the whole world, sympathize with me in the irreparable loss we've all suffered.
The room changed the moment Charles reached the final page. What appeared at first to be another private matter concerning Balmoral suddenly carried the name of his brother Andrew, and beneath it, a request that reached far beyond family privilege. Andrew wanted his daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, secured within Balmoral's future trustee structure. Charles did not raise his voice. He simply placed the papers on the table and asked one devastating question: who approved this? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew Balmoral was never just another royal residence. In this dramatized account, it carried memories of family summers, private grief, inherited duty, and the weight of decisions meant to outlive the people making them. A trustee structure, in plain terms, meant the group given formal responsibility to help oversee long-term management and protect how an estate is handled. That was why the request cut so deeply. The king had discovered Andrew's private attempt to secure future trustee rights for Beatrice and Eugenie without first obtaining his approval. Andrew entered expecting resistance, perhaps even bargaining, but he knew instantly that something had shifted. The monarch had separated the papers, marked a paragraph, and left one page turned toward the chair opposite him. No accusation came at first. That silence carried more force than anger. Charles felt no hostility toward his nieces. His betrayal was aimed at his brother, because Andrew had tried to settle a deeply personal royal question through paperwork instead of a direct conversation. The wording made matters worse. One section had clearly been revised after an earlier version met resistance, suggesting the effort had not ended when the first answer came back cold. Andrew had pushed again, more carefully this time. The new language did not simply offer Beatrice and Eugenie symbolic involvement. It could preserve a continuing York family voice over parts of Balmoral's future management, giving their branch influence long after the original dispute faded. Charles removed his glasses and pushed the proposal across the table. "Did they know?" he asked. Andrew looked down, then back at his brother, but the answer did not come. That hesitation changed the meaning of everything. Was he fighting for his daughters because he feared they would lose their place in the family, or had their names become the safest way to protect something Andrew feared losing himself? And Charles intended to uncover every buried motive. Charles had uncovered the request, but understanding why Andrew had made it meant looking past the paperwork and into a family rivalry that had been quietly building for years. For Beatrice and Eugenie, the most painful part was not what Charles had discovered, it was learning that their names had become central to a battle they had never intended to fight. One phone call changed the atmosphere completely. Beatrice listened in stunned silence. Eugenie reacted more sharply. And somewhere between their father's determination and their uncle's authority, two daughters suddenly realized that Balmoral had become a symbol of something much more personal: belonging. Beatrice stayed quiet long after the call ended. She had just learned that Andrew had placed both daughters inside a proposal concerning Balmoral's future, without asking them directly. The estate meant something deeply emotional to their father. For him, it carried childhood summers, memories of his parents, and a sense of family life before his place within the monarchy became more complicated. Balmoral itself was the royal family's private Scottish estate, closely tied to generations of personal memory rather than public ceremony. To Andrew, losing influence there felt dangerously close to losing part of his own history. Eugenie felt the danger immediately. She told her sister that whatever their father believed he was protecting, they could not appear to be demanding power from Charles. Beatrice understood why. Neither sister occupied the same constitutional path as William and his children, whose positions placed them much closer to the monarchy's future leadership. The Prince of Wales was the heir expected to succeed the king, while his children stood directly behind him in the succession. That difference made Andrew's request far more sensitive. The wording troubled them even more. Beatrice learned that the proposal described their involvement as necessary for continuity. In this context, continuity meant preserving one branch of the family inside Balmoral's long-term decision-making structure. Andrew believed the word would carry emotional force. Rejecting it could be made to look like Charles was deliberately pushing the York branch out. Eugenie refused to accept that logic. During a private conversation, She closed the door and turned toward her sister. "We need to know exactly what Dad promised in our names." Beatrice agreed. Neither wanted their relationship with Charles damaged by an arrangement they had never requested. Beatrice then understood the fear underneath Andrew's actions. As the king reorganized private responsibilities around William's eventual reign, their father could see his branch losing influence. He was not simply fighting for a technical role. He was fighting against the feeling that his family was slowly being moved to the edge. That realization made the sisters uneasy rather than reassured, because Andrew's fear had not appeared suddenly. To understand why he pushed the request so far, the family had to return to the evening when a seemingly ordinary conversation at Balmoral became the moment everything changed. The confrontation had not begun in an office. It began months earlier at Balmoral, after dinner, when a conversation about the estate's future took a turn Andrew never forgot. The fire was still burning. Coffee had just been served. William was discussing long-term responsibilities with Charles, when Andrew asked one seemingly simple question about whether Beatrice and Eugenie would have a future voice there. Charles answered carefully. But Andrew heard something else entirely: the gradual closing of a door. Charles believed he was discussing responsibility, not exclusion. He told William that Balmoral's future stewardship had to follow clear lines of accountability, with each person knowing exactly what authority they carried and why. Stewardship, in simple terms, meant the long-term responsibility for protecting, managing, and making decisions about the estate. The king did not want every branch of the family competing for equal control, simply because they shared the same history. Andrew listened, but the explanation only deepened his discomfort. Andrew finally asked the question that had been building inside him. Would Beatrice and Eugenie have any formal place in Balmoral's future governance? Charles paused before answering. He said family connection would remain important, but formal authority could not be promised simply to preserve balance between different branches. Andrew heard the words as something colder. To him, his daughters were being pushed toward a future where they might visit Balmoral as relatives, yet hold no meaningful voice in a place tied to their grandparents and childhood. William noticed the change immediately. Andrew's face tightened, and the warmth of the evening disappeared. The prince chose not to challenge him, while his uncle avoided an open argument. Instead, Andrew placed his coffee down, gave a short reply, and left earlier than anyone expected. Charles watched him go, aware that the conversation had landed badly, but unaware of what his brother would do next. Andrew did not sleep easily. Later that night, he privately contacted an advisor and asked whether a trustee position could preserve some future involvement for Beatrice and Eugenie, without requiring either woman to become a working royal. A working royal, put simply, is a family member who carries out official duties on behalf of the monarch. The advisor's answer was cautious, but it was not an absolute no. That small opening was enough. Andrew began thinking beyond the dinner. A wounded question became an idea, and the idea slowly became a proposal. Before leaving Balmoral the following morning, he paused and looked back at the estate. Beatrice noticed his mood and asked what was wrong. He gave her only 4 words. Things are changing. Months later, Charles would understand exactly what he meant. When the brothers finally faced one another again, the argument was no longer about abstract family history, it was about who had the right to decide what Balmoral would become. There were no aides in the room when Charles asked Andrew to explain himself. That was deliberate. This was no longer an administrative problem. It was a confrontation between 2 brothers, carrying decades of rivalry, loyalty, disappointment, and grief. Charles wanted one answer. Why had Andrew pursued a permanent role for Beatrice and Eugenie after their earlier conversation made his position clear? Andrew's response stunned him. He said Charles had mistaken obedience for acceptance. Charles did not answer immediately. He believed Balmoral could not be divided by pressure, sentiment, or assumptions about who deserved influence because of family history. Private royal property, in simple terms, meant assets held personally by the royal family rather than controlled as public state property. That distinction mattered because responsibility for Balmoral rested on clear decisions, not automatic entitlement. The king told his brother that affection for a place did not create the right to shape its future. Andrew pushed back. He insisted he was not asking for a position for himself. His argument centered on Beatrice and Eugenie, and he said their limited royal duties should not erase their place in the family's future. Then his restraint cracked. He leaned forward and told Charles that his daughters should not grow up watching their grandparents' world become something they could enter only by invitation, because William's branch carried greater responsibility. Charles felt his anger give way to disappointment. The monarch told Andrew that if the request had truly been about protecting his daughters, then their wishes should have been established before their names appeared in any formal proposal. Using them without that certainty, he said, had placed Beatrice and Eugenie inside a conflict they had never chosen. Then Charles delivered the detail Andrew had not expected. The king had seen two versions of the proposal. The first had faced resistance. The second had been rewritten, narrowed, and submitted again. That meant this was not one emotional question asked in frustration. Andrew had continued after understanding that Charles was uncomfortable with the idea. Andrew finally admitted it. He believed that if the request became limited enough, his brother would eventually accept it. He had mistaken resistance for negotiation and kept pushing because he thought compromise was still possible. Charles closed the folder and moved it away from them both. The gesture ended the argument before either brother said another word. Andrew understood that the discussion had shifted from persuasion to judgment. Yet Charles still refused to announce his decision. Before ruling, he wanted one final answer. Who actually held the power to make such an arrangement permanent, and just how close had Andrew's proposal come to becoming real? The brothers had said what neither wanted to say, but the decisive question now moved beyond emotion. Who actually possessed the authority to make Andrew's plan real? Andrew had treated the issue like a family negotiation. Charles now treated it like a question of stewardship. Behind closed doors, the king examined exactly how far his brother's request could travel, which approvals mattered, and whether emotional pressure could ever become institutional leverage. Yet even while advisors discussed structures and responsibilities, Charles remained focused on one uncomfortable truth. Somewhere along the way, his family had begun talking about Balmoral as territory instead of home. Charles understood that the decision ultimately rested with him. In this dramatized account, a trustee arrangement meant a formal structure giving named people an ongoing role in overseeing or advising on the estate's future. That mattered because such a role would not be temporary or symbolic. Once created, it could shape expectations for years. The monarch also knew every choice had to remain workable. When William eventually inherited broader responsibility, William entered the private meeting carefully. The prince did not attack Andrew, and he did not dismiss Beatrice or Eugenie. Instead, he warned Charles that creating permanent roles simply to calm one family dispute could preserve that dispute inside the system itself. The future king understood the danger immediately. A decision meant to soothe Andrew today could become a source of resentment for another generation tomorrow. Charles felt the weight of both choices. Rejecting his brother could deepen Andrew's belief that his branch was being pushed away. Accepting the request, however, could weaken the boundaries the king had been trying to establish around responsibility, succession, and private family authority. He was not choosing between kindness and cruelty. He was choosing between emotional inclusion and structural clarity, knowing either path would hurt someone. Then the review exposed something unexpected. Andrew's revised plan was narrower than Charles first believed. Beatrice and Eugenie would not receive complete control. Their proposed role was advisory, meaning they could formally contribute views without holding the final decision themselves. That made the request more careful, more sophisticated, and far harder to dismiss as a reckless grab for power. Charles still saw the same danger underneath it. The percentage of authority did not matter as much as the principle. If one branch gained permanent representation because it feared losing influence, other branches could eventually demand the same protection. The family structure would become a collection of inherited grievances, instead of a clear chain of responsibility. Charles asked everyone to leave except William. The door closed. "I will not leave you a family structure built on unresolved grievances," he said quietly. William understood immediately. Andrew's request was finished. But the decision itself was only the beginning. Charles still had to tell Beatrice and Eugenie what their father had attempted, and why their names could no longer remain inside the arrangement. Charles had reached his decision in private. Now that decision had to survive the emotional cost of becoming real. Andrew knew the answer before Charles finished speaking. The proposed trustee arrangement would not proceed. No permanent Balmoral rights would be created for Beatrice or Eugenie through his request, and no revised version would be entertained. For several seconds, Andrew remained completely still. The anger that had carried him through the earlier confrontation disappeared. What replaced it was quieter and more difficult to watch. He had tried to preserve his daughter's place. Instead, he had endangered their peace. Charles made the decision unmistakable. The king rejected the proposal and ordered the matter closed, meaning Andrew could not simply rewrite the request again and return with softer language. Permanent decision-making rights, in this context, meant formal authority designed to continue beyond a temporary family arrangement. Charles stressed that Beatrice and Eugenie were not being pushed out of family life. His judgment concerned power, not affection. The distinction mattered, but Andrew barely reacted. Andrew stayed behind after his brother left. He did not call his daughters immediately. He simply remained seated, staring at the empty chair across from him, as if the argument were still happening there. For months, he had convinced himself that persistence proved loyalty. Now the same persistence looked dangerously close to something else, refusing to accept that the family's structure had changed. Beatrice eventually confronted him privately. She was not furious because Charles had rejected the request. She was hurt because Andrew had placed her name inside a struggle she had never agreed to fight. Her father tried to explain that he had wanted to protect her future, but she stopped him. Balmoral mattered deeply to her, she said, yet she did not want that connection transformed into a contest over influence. Eugenie pressed even harder. She asked Andrew whether the proposal had truly been about his daughters, or whether some part of him was terrified that he himself was becoming irrelevant. The question landed harder than Charles's refusal. Andrew tried to answer, then stopped. His silence became an admission neither daughter needed explained. Beatrice reached for the printed proposal resting nearby. She folded it once and placed it aside. "I don't want Balmoral secured for me through resentment," she told him. Andrew had no argument left. He finally understood that paternal concern and personal fear had become tangled together until even he could no longer separate them. Charles had rejected his plan with authority, but Beatrice had dismantled its emotional justification with a single sentence. That private rejection changed Andrew more deeply than the royal decision ever could. For the first time, he was forced to confront the possibility that winning a place for his daughters meant nothing if they did not want it won this way, and that realization would send him back to Charles under very different circumstances. The second meeting looked nothing like the first. There were no files between them, no advisors waiting outside with notes, and no argument prepared in advance. Andrew asked to see Charles simply as his brother. When he entered, Charles did not return to the rejected proposal. Instead, Andrew surprised him by admitting that Beatrice had challenged the reason he pursued it. For once, the dispute over Balmoral stopped being about authority and became a conversation about fear. Andrew spoke more quietly than before. He admitted that watching responsibility gather around Charles, then William, and eventually George, had forced him to face an uncomfortable truth. His own branch of the family was moving further from the monarchy's operational center. That phrase simply meant the group carrying the greatest share of official royal responsibility. Andrew understood the logic, but understanding it did not make the emotional loss easier. Charles listened without interrupting. The king knew changing roles could leave people feeling diminished even when the structure itself made sense. William's future position, and George's place behind him, reflected succession, not personal rejection. Yet Charles also understood that family history did not disappear just because official responsibility shifted. For Andrew, that distinction had become painfully blurred. Andrew finally said what he had avoided saying from the beginning. He feared Beatrice and Eugenie would one day arrive at Balmoral feeling they belonged there only because someone had invited them, not because their own memories gave them a permanent connection. The thought had haunted him. He had imagined his daughters standing outside a family world that once seemed unquestionably theirs. Charles answered with equal calm. Belonging, he said, could not be guaranteed by a title placed beside a name. A trustee list could create authority, but it could not create love, memory, or family connection. The monarch promised that Beatrice and Eugenie would not lose their emotional bond with Balmoral simply because they held no permanent governing power there. Andrew hesitated, then made another admission. During their private conversation, He revealed that he had considered withdrawing the proposal before Charles discovered it. Pride stopped him. He had already pushed too far, and could not bring himself to admit that the effort had become more about proving his place than protecting his daughters. Charles finally gave him the distinction he had needed all along. Family access could be protected. Family connection could be respected. But emotional inheritance would not be converted into permanent authority. Andrew slowly nodded. Then tell them that not me. Charles agreed to speak personally with Beatrice and Eugenie. Inside the room, two brothers had finally found clarity. Outside the palace walls, their private argument was about to become a national spectacle. By morning, the family dispute had escaped the private rooms, where Charles hoped it would remain. Balmoral, the place associated with summer photographs, quiet walks, and the final years of Queen Elizabeth II, was suddenly being discussed as the center of a struggle over legacy. Headlines reduced a deeply personal conflict to winners and losers. Yet one photograph changed the mood entirely. Beatrice arriving alone, expression solemn, refusing to answer questions about whether she ever wanted the role her father pursued. Charles watched the public reaction harden almost immediately. Some voices saw his decision as necessary consolidation, meaning a deliberate effort to keep authority clear rather than spreading formal power across different branches of the family. Others sympathized with Andrew, arguing that a father had simply tried to preserve a connection for his daughters. The king understood why the debate mattered. Once Balmoral became a symbol of exclusion, the emotional truth of the family dispute risked disappearing beneath the spectacle. Beatrice felt that pressure directly. As she arrived for a private royal meeting, photographers called questions about Andrew and whether she believed Charles had treated her fairly. She did not respond. Her silence carried more weight than any statement could have. Palace communications soon stressed that no personal rupture existed between the king and his nieces. The disagreement concerned future stewardship and formal authority, not whether Beatrice or Eugenie still belonged within the family. Eugenie refused to let the story become a personal attack on Charles. In a private recorded conversation, later summarized within this dramatized account, she made one point clear: affection should never have to be proven through institutional privilege. She would not allow the dispute to be turned into a contest between love and power. That position quietly weakened the argument that Andrew's proposal had been necessary to protect his daughters. Then the coverage intensified. A fictional morning newspaper appeared, with the stark front-page headline, "Balmoral Line Drawn," placed above photographs of Charles and Andrew. Television reports repeatedly returned to the same moment. Beatrice walking silently past assembled cameras while questions followed her. That image defined the story more powerfully than the original proposal ever had. Outside Balmoral, the mood shifted again. A small group of visitors gathered near the gates as television crews prepared live reports. One elderly woman stepped forward and placed flowers near the roadside in memory of Queen Elizabeth II. The gesture changed the tone. Suddenly, the argument looked smaller beside the history everyone was fighting to preserve. Commentators still wondered whether Andrew might challenge the decision or search for another route. Charles knew that speculation would continue unless he acted. The dispute had become larger than the proposal that started it, leaving Charles with one final responsibility: to close the matter without allowing two daughters to carry their father's defeat. Charles's final move was not another rejection. It was an invitation. Beatrice and Eugenie were asked to meet him privately, without Andrew, without advisors, and without the proposal that had caused the rupture. The king wanted them to hear directly what weeks of confrontation had obscured. Balmoral's future governance would remain firmly defined, but their connection to the place and to the family memories inside it was not being taken from them. The distinction finally ended the crisis. Charles spoke carefully, because he knew this conversation was about more than authority. He told Beatrice and Eugenie that Andrew's requested trustee arrangement was permanently closed and would not return under different wording. A hereditary managerial role, in simple terms, would mean formal influence passed or protected through family position, rather than earned through a specific current responsibility. The monarch made clear that he would not create such power simply to reassure one branch of the family. But he also told his nieces that Balmoral would never become proof of whether they belonged. Beatrice finally said what had hurt her most. She had never believed she needed a formal title beside her name to prove that memories with her grandparents were real. What frightened her was the idea that other people might now think she had demanded one. Charles listened without interrupting. When she finished, he told her plainly that he did not see her as part of Andrew's challenge. He saw her as someone caught inside it. Eugenie answered with even greater clarity. She said she would rather remember Balmoral as a granddaughter and niece than become trapped in a permanent fight over who controlled it. That choice removed the strongest emotional argument Andrew had used from the beginning. His daughters did not want institutional power to validate family affection. They wanted the family itself. Andrew accepted that truth later in a private conversation with both daughters. He admitted that he should have asked what they wanted before trying to secure something in their names. Beatrice did not celebrate the admission, and Eugenie did not punish him for it. They simply let the silence settle, because there was nothing left to win. Andrew then approached Charles without papers, advisors, or demands. The brothers shook hands. It was not dramatic reconciliation. It was something quieter and harder. Acceptance. Charles had drawn the boundary he wanted. Affection did not automatically create authority. Ancestry did not guarantee permanent power. And family change could not be repaired by turning old fears into new institutions. Balmoral remained exactly what the argument had nearly caused everyone to forget. Not a prize to be divided between competing branches of the Windsors, but a place whose meaning survived precisely because Charles finally separated the question of who belongs there from the question of who has the right to rule it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.